This is the Everything 80s Podcast, Episode 4, The Story of My Pet Monster.
My pet monster, on him I can depend. My pet monster, a monster of a friend. He's big and blue and scary, but a friendly monster too. My pet monster, I love you. He's always playing scary tricks, but I know that's
Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s Podcast, brought to you by everything80spodcast.com. I'm Jamie, and we're looking at what happens when you combine a teddy bear with some sort of monstrous creature. You get My Pet Monster, and hopefully that intro song is bringing you back to the cartoon show and everything like that. But we're looking at the idea of what goes behind specifically marketing something to boys and trying to capitalize on the entire market and not trying to, isolate anyone and trying to bring in as much of an audience as you can in whatever combination. So we're going to look at how My Pet Monster came out in 1986. It was produced by American Greetings. It spawned a popular cartoon show that year. And like I said, the original intent behind My Pet Monster was to capitalize on the young male demographic by offering a plush toy that hopefully boys would want to play with. So before we start, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you find your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Google, wherever you look for them, I should be there. Okay, let's get into this. It probably helps to take a look at a picture of a My Pet Monster toy, hopefully to remember what this odd creation looked like. He had blue plush fur, horns, he had a fang smile, and he had orange plastic handcuffs. And weirdly, the handcuffs would be one of the defining characteristics of this toy. They had a breakaway chain, if you remember this, so he could be worn by a kid, so he could be attached to his new pal. Kind of like a messed up version of, do you remember My Buddy, that kid's doll or boy's doll or whatever? But My Buddy was also the big influence behind Chucky from the Child's Play movies, but that's a whole other show. So with My Pet Monster, there were various sizes of the doll, and there was a bunch of spin-off characters. I don't know if you remember things like Gwonk, Wogster, Rark, all those things. And the initial popularity grew really fast as they had a very good marketing campaign that made it basically impossible not to see a My Pet Monster commercial. Like they loaded this thing into so many different networks, Saturday morning cartoons. It was just hard to ignore it. And it was kind of easier back then to advertise when you think there was only really 3 networks. And if you're on one of those, there's a good chance everyone was going to see you. No internet, no streaming services. It was a little easier to sort of push it. And this led, the awareness led to a crap load of extra merchandising, including like coloring books, puzzles, lunch boxes, anything you could pretty much slap a logo on at that point. I swear I had a My Pet Monster lunchbox. I can't prove it, but I swear I can. I looked everywhere. I looked for pictures. I don't know. Rest in peace, that lunchbox. So the whole idea here is this was one of the first plush dolls marketed specifically to boys at the time. When you think about the idea of dolls for boys, it really started with G.I. Joe, which could, it was kind of considered the male Barbie, and then, changing the name into action figure. So the idea that a boy wasn't playing with a doll or whatever, but that was just sort of the mindset at the time. But that mechanism had been in place for quite a while. In G.I. Joe goes back to the 60s, and then with the release in the 80s, it's a little more ingrained. But in the plush toy category, the boy market hadn't really been targeted. So the company that put out was called American Greeting, and they wanted to create something soft and like cuddly, but that appealed to boys, hence the name My Pet Monster. And that's why he was designed with fangs and the handcuffs and supposed to be sort of a rough and horror-based, character or whatever. So they had this odd job of having to create something that looked menacing, but not too menacing. You know, you didn't want it to look like it was going to come to life in the middle of the night and kill you in your sleep. Tough but cute, you know, like me. Sorry, I'm kidding. And I think they actually pulled it off pretty well. I specifically remember thinking it was pretty cool. And I think I thought of My Pet Monster more of a character and like a big action figure more than like a cuddly toy. He happened to be made soft and made up of blue hair in my young mind. That's just like one of the original impressions I had of it. So through the 80s, there's a lot of examples of cartoon shows that were created first in order to launch a toy. And, you know, listen to episode 2 all about the Transformers. I did probably one of the most notable examples. They used a 3-part series to introduce the toy line, G.I. Joe as well too. So to our young minds at the time, we had no idea we were basically just watching 22-minute long commercials. If you look back on the shows from that time, you notice how any character being talked to, they always mention their full name as it would appear on the product that you would buy in the stores. Anytime they would reference a vehicle or an accessory, they would make mention of the full name of that vehicle so you knew what you were looking for in the toy store. So they obviously have to make the character known for quick branding. And, you know, it would lead to very unnatural conversations in cartoon shows. That's why they're so like clunky and disjointed. But the timeline with My Pet Monster in this situation is a bit hazy. So the toy definitely came first, and then it looks like the cartoon was made due to the huge popularity. So this is a big gamble, putting all your money into a TV show with the risk that it won't be successful, and then you're stuck with a warehouse full of unwanted toys. It's inevitable that a successful toy line will spawn a TV show like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or whatever. The problem that arises is you are left under the gun a bit, and you don't have a lot of time to get a show up on the air. So it's not hard to see the shows that suffered from this, as there's a lot of simple animation, not a lot of action or changing landscapes. You can see it's easy to identify cartoons that had a real rush job put onto it. The thing with the My Pet Monster cartoon is that it did have a pretty catchy theme song. Maybe you're even still in your head now if you're listening to it. It had a bit of an Addams Family ripoff to it, so it was kind of identifiable and recognizable, and I think that's what helped make the cartoon more successful. So I don't recall, but the My Pet Monster TV show only lasted 1 season, and I think this was a kind of a quick take the money and run situation, as they probably knew they didn't have a long-lasting franchise on their hands. So looking back at sort of the story and the character, the show is based around My Pet Monster, would be referred to as Monster for the duration of the show, and he lived with a boy named Max. If you remember back to the show, anytime Monster would have his handcuffs put on, he would turn back into the stuffed animal version, kind of like a Calvin and Hobbes scenario there. So some of the premise of the show involved Max keeping Monster's secret from anyone. This sort of had reminded me of Alf a bit too. And the only two that knew about Monster were Max's sister Jill and his friend Chucky, which is an interesting name choice at the time. So this is interesting looking on the show with some of the voice actors. If you are Canadian like me, the character Max was voiced by a kid named Sonny Beeson Thrasher, which might be the greatest name of all time. He also did voices for the Garbage Pail Kids, Babar, Care Bears, and he appeared on the iconic Beachcombers. If you're Canadian, you know exactly what that is. If not, don't worry. And then the character Jill was voiced by another Canadian named Alison Court, and she did a lot of voices in some big things like Care Bears and Garbage Pail Kids, but also Star Wars Ewoks, playing the character first done by Winona Ryder. She was in Beetlejuice, did X-Men The Animated Adventures, pivotal part of the 80s. And again, if you're Canadian, she appeared on Mr. Dress Up, which is the most iconic thing in the world. So another premise of the show was the adversary. Do you remember Mr. Hinkle? He was a neighbor who always thinks Max is up to something. Dennis the Menace vibes there. So he was actually right the whole time, as Max possessed some sort of otherworldly demon, essentially. So then there was, you remember, Beastor, who was kind of a Sully from Monsters, Inc. sort of vibe there. And Beastor hated light and was always trying to bring back Monster to Monsterland. And then those good old magic cuffs served even more purpose as they were able to resort Beastor to a smaller version, even though he's still alive, if you recall that. And so another fun fact, pretty much the entire cast was recruited after the show to provide most of the voices of the Beetlejuice cartoon in 1989, which was not bad, actually. So then, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a My Pet Monster movie. This was a direct-to-video live-action movie. Anything direct-to-video is usually the kiss of death for something. And it was also cranked out in 1986. So this to me sort of furthers the idea that it was for them a put all your eggs in one basket situation, knowing it wasn't going to sustain itself very long. So the movie, this thing had a bit of a different approach, as the premise was about a boy who became My Pet Monster after being exposed to a statue. There was a character named Dr. Snyder who wanted to kidnap him for publicity purposes, kind of like a modern retelling of King Kong, but with blue fur. And in the movie, the sister's name is changed to Melanie and was also voiced by Allison Court, who did the cartoon show. So, like, for the life of me, I don't remember this thing, but you can look up the trailer and clips, and you might even find the whole movie on YouTube. But if you go to the show notes today, which is like the entire article this is based on, and it's got images and videos. So everything80spodcast.com/4, and I got the movie trailer up on there. This thing's actually creepy as hell the more I watched it. And I don't know what kids were into this thing or if it found an audience on home video, but who knows. So My Pet Monster, like most things that are based around 80s nostalgia, it comes back around, and My Pet Monster is no different. So in 2001, a company named Toymax released a 22-inch talking version of it. So there's still interest in things like this, as it was in 2018, Hasbro actually acquired My Pet Monster to be able to re-release some different versions of it. So I'm not sure what the long-term plan is or what type of products they're wanting to put out, but it's Hasbro's now. They can do whatever. And I'm sure you'll see, I don't know, some sort of reboot. If you're not if you haven't seen on Netflix, they've rebooted things like The Popples. Do you remember that? Inspector Gadget. I had no idea that was even a new made show. Voltron. I think they'll always try to resurrect an old cartoon property just because if it worked back then, maybe that same impact will happen again, even though kids change through the decades, but maybe they don't that much. Maybe those same basic interests will always be there, and that's why you can always reissue something. So just wrapping it up here, I think My Pet Monster is an interesting piece of 80s nostalgia. It wasn't the most iconic and definitive toy of the 80s, nor was the TV show. The movie leaves a lot to be desired, but I still think it's one of those little topics that takes up a nice little small part of the decade. It didn't have the impact of G.I. Joe or Transformers or He-Man, but it's definitely recognizable. You're probably listening to this one because you remember it, and maybe that's what the ultimate intention was of My Pet Monster or of characters or toys like this. Not to be a game changer, but just carve out that little corner of the decade that was absolutely packed with iconic and long-lasting brands and characters. I mean, there's never really been a decade where there's been an explosion of new toys and cartoons and franchises and everything like that. It was just a time where you're coming out of the 70s and there's been deregulation, which means all the restrictions on advertising to children and promoting shows and using shows to sell toys, which is basically like what all those things were. They had free reign, and now it's why you see everything like just boom out of nowhere. G.I. Joe, Transformers, Strawberry Shortcake, My Pet Monster, everything like that. So I think toy manufacturers were aware of this, that this is kind of like the Wild West of kids stuff and commerce and toys and cartoons, and they knew there was some big established heavyweights in the market and you weren't going to beat them, and you didn't want to be drowned out by all the noise and all the distractions. And think of the amount of just like Saturday morning cartoons you watch and how many different ones, like you just needed something to be identifiable and make your mark. And this is, I think My Pet Monster is one of those perfect examples of get in, make a splash, and get out. And I think that's basically what they do. To me, it still represents a big part of the 80s, and I'll always associate it with a decade. You probably will too. And to me, that's what makes it successful. It's obviously made an impact because, like, just putting together all like this whole podcast and the episode and looking back on the trailers and the cartoon, it's something that stuck out that I thought is worth taking a look at. You know, just for the love of God, don't watch that movie or check it out. It's horrible. Okay, so that'll be it. It's just a quick topic here to cover. Some are a lot more in depth, but like I said, this one doesn't go super as deep as some of them. Say like Teddy Ruxpin. That has a crazy backstory with how deep that thing gets. But that's a whole other episode. This is just, you know, a quick little revisit back. So thanks for taking the time to listen. Hope you enjoyed this. Again, if you haven't, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcast. And if you really like the show, give it a rating and review. That way more people get to see it. Makes my mom proud of me, and then everybody's happy. All right, thanks for listening. See you soon. Bye.